Hi there. So we're gonna finish our Constitutional Convention lesson. We're gonna finally kind of conclude and really get through and go into a little bit more deeply issues 1 through 4. So let's start. So last class we started talking about the first two issues that they tackle: creating a functional government. And we went through this slide and we talked about, this need and this realization that the Articles of Confederation can't be fixed, and then this division on where exactly power should come from, and this debate on who should be really in charge. Should it be the national government, or should the states still control and have most of the power? And of course, you're going to have two major groups that disagree in terms of that. And it's sort of James Madison who gets up again and basically says, whoa, wait a minute. We talked about having a representative democracy. And in order to have a representative democracy, we need to make sure that we infuse this idea of popular sovereignty. So he's going to kind of keep everybody in check and make sure that everybody is extremely clear on knowing, what needs to be in place. So that's sort of where we left off. We started kind of working on the Venn diagram, and that is all pasted into your notebook at this point, so you should be good to go. So we're going to move right along and start talking a little bit more about each plan. So Edmund Randolph of Virginia, he was quite friendly with James Madison and George Washington. He stands up and proposes something that he's going to call the Virginia Plan, and of course he names it after his own state. And things like that do kind of go to show you how much pride these men really did have for the place that they lived. And so the first thing that he says is, right, I think there should be a national government that has 3 branches. And he talks very specifically about what each of those 3 branches should do. So he says, there's going to be something called the legislative branch, and their job's going to be to make the laws. Then we're going to have an executive branch, and that person or that group or that branch's job will be to enforce or execute the laws. And then we're going to have a judicial branch, and that branch's job will be to interpret, to understand, and to make sure that the law isn't being violated. So there's going to be these 3 branches, and again, this idea of separation of powers comes into play, this idea from Montesquieu, and you can really see, again, how the Enlightenment just sort of infiltrates and affects every decision that they all seem to make. So Randolph presents this idea, and everybody's pretty cool with this part. But then he says this: I want Congress to be made up of something he's going to call a bicameral legislature. So the legislative body, the lawmaking body, the body that most people, the branch that most people believe has the most power, is going to be made up of 2 houses according to the Virginia Plan. And if you look, right, bicameral, think of the root word there. Bi means 2. The first house, he says, is going to be called the House of Representatives. And that house, okay, will have a certain role in making the law. And the second house, he says, is going to be called the Senate. And both of the houses, so both parts of the legislative making body, is going to be based on the population of each state. And so each state will get a certain number of representatives, or what today we call, right, House of Representatives, congressmen or congresswomen, or senators, and those senators will each have a vote in terms of making the law. Now this sounds great. If you are what? Think about that for a minute. This sounds like a really good idea if you have a large population. Exactly. If you have a large population, this plan works for you, because based on how many people live in your state, the more people that live within your state means the more representatives, and therefore the more votes that you get in the lawmaking body. And so the larger states love it, but then the smaller states speak up. And William Patterson of New Jersey speaks up and he goes, whoa, 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 wait a minute. That's not fair. Just because I live in a smaller state, I shouldn't get as much of a say in how the laws are made in my country, the country that I fought for. And, you know, in a way, Patterson has a point. He says, if we pass this Virginia plan, the small states will never have any say. And we will be really, okay, will be, the large states are going to be the king. The large states are the tyranny. The large states are going to be the dictators in our new country. And they're going to dictate to the smaller states what the law should be. And that's not fair. And he also argues that, you know, many of the smaller states are landlocked. They have water surrounding them, and they're never going to get bigger. So a state like New Jersey is never going to grow in size unless it takes over a bigger state like Pennsylvania, and he's right. So he basically says, listen, we can't do this by size. We can't do it by population. What we have to do is, I'm okay with that 3-branch idea that you had, Mr. Randolph. Let's keep that. But we should just have a unicameral, so Uni 1, lawmaking branch, legislative branch, and they're going to have just one house, and each state would get an equal number of representatives in Congress no matter what its population, and if we do that, then the small states can't get swallowed up by the big states. And the large states say, well, why the heck are we here then? Because this sounds an awful lot like the Articles of Confederation. Remember, during the Articles of Confederation, each state had one vote in their lawmaking body, in their Congress. And so people are like, you know, what are we doing here? You just proposed the exact same idea. This makes no sense. And the large and small states are so close, remember we did that count the other day, it was like 6 and 7, that the entire convention's divided. So you have all the representatives from the large states backing the Virginia plan, and you have all the representatives from the small states backing the New Jersey plan, and this first issue really threatens to break the entire convention up. In fact, many people thought that the convention, many of the delegates thought the convention was going to fizzle out. And a lot of representatives from the smaller states threatened to leave. People from Maryland, people from New Jersey threatened to leave if there couldn't be some kind of compromise. So it takes about a week, but Roger Sherman of Connecticut comes up with an idea. And it's called the Great Compromise, and sometimes you'll see it written as the Connecticut Compromise. They're the same thing, so Great Compromise and Connecticut Compromise being the same thing. And this is what Sherman says. He kind of thinks about it, and he says, you know, what if we could, like, combine some of the elements of the Virginia plan and some of the elements of the New Jersey plan and kind of put them together. So he keeps that 3-branch of government, okay? And he kind of, this visual at the bottom here is a really good representation. He says we're going to have a legislative, an executive, and a judicial branch. And they're all going to do different things. So we're going to keep that separation of powers and that system of checks and balances in place. And he says, I like that part of the Virginia plan where we have a bicameral legislature. We're going to call that whole thing Congress. And Congress is going to be divided into an upper house and a lower house. The upper house is going to be called the Senate, and representatives in the Senate will be based on equality. Each state will get 2 representatives. So the small states are like, okay, I'm okay with that. And he says, and then we're going to have something called the lower house, and that will be a House of Representatives, and that house will be based on how many people live within each state. It will be based on the state population. And everybody from the larger states say, I can live with that. That's a good, I can do that. And so basically what you're going to do is you're going to break up the lawmaking function into these 2 separate branches, okay, these 2 separate houses. And the Senate is going to be a smaller house made up of 2 representatives for each state, so at this time it's only going to be 26 total representatives. And they're going to make sure that they help to pass the laws, and they're going to do different things. They're going to work on the budget. They're going to work on war functions. They're going to do completely different things. And the House of Representatives is going to be more representative of the people because it's going to be based on a state's population. So the bigger states will have a little bit of a larger say in the House, but not so much, right, that they'll overpower this. That they'll overpower it. It's just that they're representative more of the people. And their job, okay, will be to work on taxes and coming up with the idea of the law and all kinds of things like that. So there, again, you still have this system of checks and balances even within one of the legislative branches. So when Sherman proposes this idea, he sort of saves the convention. I mean, this is one of the people, most historians, most politicians, cite the Great Compromise as being one of the saviors of American history, because Sherman found a way to bridge this gap, to forge together these two divisions within the convention, these large and small states. He bridges that gap, he brings them together, and because of this wonderful idea that he has, the convention goes on. And perhaps if he hadn't done what he had done in that first month or so, okay, in that May through June month, who knows what would have happened. So that's sort of why it was renamed the Great Compromise, because of just how great, how spectacular, how amazing, and how definitive it was for the Americans who were working so hard to kind of create this new nation. And that's also why Connecticut is called the Constitution State. That's what their license plate says, if you've ever seen one from Connecticut. And it's because of him. He's sort of the guy. So at this point, you should make this chart on page 51. It'll be the only thing that goes on 51. Some of you have pasted it in. If you didn't paste it in and you want to draw it, that's fine. And at this point, you should pause the lecture because you're going to be completing a reading. And based on that reading, you'll be able to fill in the differences in the economies between the North and the South, their views on slavery, and then, of course, the tax issue. Some of this stuff you might recall from U.S. history, but it's a good idea also to make sure that you're really carefully reading that article so that you have a general idea of how the next issue, which each side is coming from that next issue. So you're going to want to pause the lecture at this point until you finish reading the article. Okay, so we're back. So hopefully your chart's completely filled out. I'm sure that, again, that you had a lot of background information on that anyways, but you should feel really, really confident right now that, you're in a good spot where you kind of know where each side is coming from, because the next issue is another one that's going to threaten to sort of break up the entire convention. It's a mess. It results in a ton of arguments. So let's get started. So the next issue that the founders are going to talk about is how exactly a state's population would be determined. And again, this is going to be kind of a big deal because they've just come up with this Great Compromise that relies on a state's population for defining how many representative each state's going to get. And so it's going to kind of be a big deal to figure out how exactly do we figure out a state's population. Do we count just males? Do we count males and females? Do we count kids? Do we count voters, so only people who are eligible to vote? How exactly does this work? What exactly can we do here? So at this point, it's really helpful to know that 9 out of 10 slaves, so basically 90% of the slaves in America at this time were living in the South. So we talked about the 4 free states that existed, but it's really important to recognize just how many, when you're talking about that many slaves, and 90% of them living in the South, this is going to be a very contentious issue, particularly for Southerners. Now, the Southerners are smart. The reps from the Southern states realize, well, we got a lot of people in the South that are African American slaves. And if we only say that white people or voters are going to be the ones that count towards the population, then we're not going to be those large states that we actually thought we were. We're only large because so much of our population is made up of these slaves. And so they say, you can't just count population based on voters. You have to count it on everyone that lives in the country. Everyone that lives in the state has to be counted toward the total population. And the Northerners, they sort of look at the Southerners and kind of say, you guys are hypocrites. Because, on the one hand, you want them to count towards your population, but on the other hand, you treat them really awful, and they're slaves. And people actually start arguing about the difference between what is the difference between a slave and what is the difference between a horse. Or should we count horses? Should we count the number of chairs? Should we count the number of tables and tools that you have? Does that count towards your population? And that brings in a whole separate issue of taxes. Should you tax slaves? How is property going to be taxed? And what the fundamental argument that they're having is, are slaves people or are slaves property? Because if they're people, then they ought to have the rights that all people do. And this, again, kind of spirals into a whole other discussion where people start bringing in the Declaration of Independence and reading it out loud at the convention, talking about what does this mean that all men are actually created equal. And the Northerners, they kind of throw it back in the Southerners' face, say, you need to make a choice. Are they people or are they property? And again, you have these people saying, well, if they're going to be counted towards your population, then you got to let them vote. And that brings an issue of women. Well, if you're going to count them towards the population, then you got to let them vote. So the idea of slavery, this one topic, brings up about 5 different ones. It brings up the idea of taxes. It brings up the idea of women voting. It brings up the idea of equality and what really constitutes freedom. Are we protecting freedom here? Are we living up to the ideals that we defined in the Declaration of Independence? And again, the Southern states this time threaten to pull out. And they say, you can't make us get rid of slavery, and if you do, we're done. We'll form our own country. We can't, they really basically say our economy, our cash crops, our tobacco, our cotton, our rice crops cannot survive without the labor of slaves. And it is so incredibly important to their livelihoods, their way of life. It's ingrained in what they believe in. It's part of their history that when some of the Northern delegates start kind of pushing at them and making them think about all of these things, this idea of people are property, it forces them to really basically, say, if you're going to take away how we make our money, we can't be with you. And so, again, there's this threat, that the convention's going to fall apart, that nothing's going to get solved, and that this United States won't ever even really exist. And then the 3/5 compromise comes along. So, this compromise always kind of trips kids up because conceptually it's really, really difficult to think of people this way. It's very racist. It's very, it's really awful. And it's the reality. This is, again, Benjamin Franklin had an extremely hard time with this and really thought that this was America's moment to ban slavery, to be the first country to do it, to put its foot down, and to really fulfill its promises of the Declaration. And he was so disappointed by the fact that this couldn't happen. But this does kind of save the country, and it does save the convention. So Madison basically proposes this idea that Instead of counting each slave as one person, you would count them as 3/5 of a person when you're determining a state's population and in terms of their tax purposes. So if you look at the visual up here, right, you have 5 white men up top, and then on the bottom, right, they would be the same 5 African American slaves, but 2 of them would not count. So if you had 10 people, 5 of them being white, 5 of them being slaves, you would only count 8 people. So this, the smaller states are kind of happy about it because it reduces the total southern population by a fraction. It reduces it by 3/5. So they're not getting swallowed up by those large southern states. And it keeps the Southerners happy because while it doesn't count the slaves as a whole person, it doesn't, put them at risk of losing their voice in the House of Representatives, which is what essentially what both sides were arguing, is that the Northerners didn't want to lose their voice by counting the slaves, and the Southerners didn't want to lose their voice in the House of Representatives by not counting the slaves. And the Northerners do basically agree to the 3/5 compromise, but they put in one more condition. They basically say, we'll agree to this, we'll agree to your tax, clause here, we'll agree to the 3/5 compromise. However, we want the slave trade to end in 20 years. So it would be by 1810 that slavery would no longer be permitted in the United States. And that goes back to kind of like the triangle trade. And on the surface, it sounds nice. It sounds like slavery might actually end, by 1810. But the reality there is that slaves can reproduce. And because they can reproduce, although you're not bringing them directly in from Africa, that doesn't mean that slavery is going to dispel. It doesn't mean that it's going to vanish and disappear. So on paper, it looks like America has made this really great concession that, that slavery is going to end and be done with in 20 years, and by 1810 there's going to be this completely free nation on our hands. But the reality is that we know that that's not true. That because slaves can reproduce, they will, and slavery will endure for another almost 100 years. Last issue, the executive. Now, this issue doesn't have as much debate as the two before, but there's more fear. So people are going to propose a lot of different ideas, but this one I think is actually the one that the founder didn't threaten to break up the convention by any means, but it threatened the framers and the founders' liberties. They were very, very skeptical of putting one person in charge. The idea of an executive reminded them so closely of a king. And again, it's that knowing, that reminiscing, that experience that they had and remembering how their rights had been so violated, that always kind of keeps them on edge, always kind of keeps them apprehensive. So, and you don't actually, need to necessarily write this down, but Representative James Wilson stands up and he basically says, we haven't talked about the executive branch yet, and I think that we should put one person in charge. We'll call them the chief executive, and they should be the person to run the country. And when he says it, the convention goes silent. People are stunned that, again, it's sort of this like, what are we doing here? Don't you get it? This is supposed to be different. We can't do what just happened to us. We can't propose this to the people out there. And this is part of, again, all these debates are part of the reason why Madison wanted to make sure the convention was secrecy. Because, right, imagine if an idea like that had gotten into the wrong hands in the wrong newspaper, there could have been a mob, right? People could have, tried to overthrow what the framers and the founders were doing in Independence Hall. So when he proposes this, people are stunned. They can't believe that he suggested it. And Randolph gets up again and basically says, no, we're not putting one person in charge. I think instead we should put 3 people in charge. And that would, make sure that the executive was also checked and balanced, just like the legislative branch is checked and balanced. And so he basically says if we put 3 people in charge, then there can't be any one person won't have power. It would be in 3 people's hands. And most people argue that's a pretty stupid idea, Randolph, because 3 people can't make, it's really, really hard for people to make decisions, the really tough decisions that a person in charge would need to make, is extremely difficult, and we want to make sure that that person has power to do that. So basically everyone kind of gets rid of Randolph's idea. So they end up deciding to have one person in charge, this chief executive. They end up going with Wilson's idea. It takes a lot of debate and talking to get through, and they do put certain checks and powers and limits on that, and we'll discuss that more when we look at the actual Constitution next week. But the problem was how to choose it. Now, we talked before that while this idea of popular sovereignty and giving people access into our government and giving them a voice in our government is real, we also know that the founders were very skeptical of the common man, that they didn't trust him, that they weren't sure that he was educated or skilled enough to make these really tough choices. And so when they talk about how you're going to choose an executive, they start arguing over who should be in charge of putting this one person in place. Should it be Congress? So should it be the House and the Senate? Or should it be the people? Should we let the citizens of America decide? And ultimately, the convention decides that they're going to put a group of electors in each state in charge of choosing the president. And that the people, us, you and I, would tell those electors through a national election, through voting, who they felt would be the best fit. And today we call this the Electoral College, and that is exactly what they wrote in the actual, Constitution. So the Electoral College is a very complicated process, and we will talk about it later in the year, but just so that you kind of have a brief understanding of what it consists of, watch this video.
So what if we don't have a football team? At least we never have to ride a theme. No classes, no professors, no tuition. Everywhere they go, of every politician. Cause everyone who graduates becomes a president. Gonna send your vote to college when you vote for president. And if you'll let me share some knowledge, you'll understand this big event. The folks who wrote our Constitution had the idea for this plan, and it's been used in our election since our government began. When you pull down on my levers for the person of your choice, you're also choosing state electors who will have the final voice. They're called the Electoral College, and they'll need to stipulate who the voters have selected to be the winner in each state. And the number of the electors that your state is going to get based on total population. That's the formula that's set. And when the popular vote is counted to find a winner in each state, people pledge all of its electors to choose the winning candidate. I like it. E-L-E-C-T-O-R-A-L. Electoral College. And we decide now. And even if the vote is close, and someone wins by just a little tiny hair, the electors give that person all their votes, and it's considered fair and square. I'm gonna send your vote to college, when you vote for president, and now the electoral college will work the way our founders meant. So what if they don't have a big macho football team? It's every politician's special dream. Cause everyone who graduates, yes, everyone who graduates, everyone graduates because of
Okay. So for homework this weekend, you're going to read an article called "A Republic If You Can Keep It," and it's by Dr. Richard Beeman. He's actually a professor at University of Pennsylvania. He's thought to be an expert on the founders and the Constitutional Convention especially. So it's not actually a long article, but it's pretty famous. Every AP student in the country reads it, so you're going to be reading it as well. And it's a fairly easy read, so it's not going to be as tough as like the last two that you've been given. So I think that you'll actually be able to kind of push through it really, really well. After reading A Republic If You Can Keep It, you should complete the quick write assignment that goes with it on page 53 in your interactive student notebook. Don't be surprised if you don't have a check-in quiz on A Republic If You Can Keep It when you come in to our next class. So if I see you on a B day, that would be Monday, and if I see you on A days, that would be Tuesday. You will also have kind of like a mini Socratic seminar. I'll explain what that is and what that looks like in class on Monday. Or Tuesday, depending on when I see you. But basically, you should be prepared to read this and discuss it. So, again, I want you to use your strategies. You should define words that you don't know. You should be annotating. You should be making connections. You should be asking questions. So part of a Socratic seminar is facilitating a discussion, so asking other people questions, but also being able to answer those questions that other people ask. And I really won't be doing much talking during the Socratic seminar. It'll kind of be you guys bouncing off ideas. I mostly will just be facilitating. But it's extremely important that you do this because you can't participate in the Socratic seminar and you will feel kind of silly. And two, you will look silly if you're not able to participate, and if you have nothing to contribute. You will be bored and you will feel silly. So my suggestion, encouragement, pushing of you, challenging of you is to make sure that you get this done. Again, it won't take too much time. It's a fairly easy read, and you will get a lot out of it. So congrats. This is your first taped lecture. You're finally done. I hope that you were able to keep up. Let me know if you have any questions. Visit the e-board or email me.